folks. I'm Katie.
I'm Vinny, and this is
Learn Real Good. Coming to your neighborhood.
Oh.
92. What was your radio station that you
My
grew
radio
up with?
station that I loved was 990 Hits.
Does that still exist?
It was an
in Montreal?
AM station. No, it's long gone.
AM.
It was AM, like right at the tail end before everyone switched. Then it switched to 95.9, the mix.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But it was like, top 40 radio friendly stuff.
Our radio station of choice was Q92.7 FM rock radio. Played a lot of dad rock, as it was called in the day.
But that was, I'm assuming, because your dad controlled the radio in the car.
Oh, we all would. Honestly, we would all choose it. There was one other channel, and it was like the Michael Bolton FM channel. Where it's all soft adult
contemporary pop.
Those were the two options, and I don't think we had an AM station to the point where, as a kid, playing with my little radio and going through all the numbers, we'd have like 3 radio stations, like the 2 stations I mentioned, and like some religious station, and then nothing on AM. So I was like, what is this AM? The other M.
Montreal has terrible radio. It's really dire. It's
coming in hot.
Yeah, we have like a very poor choice of radio. There's like CKUT. I think it's probably the university station is probably the best choice here. But
I participated in college radio, as you know.
Yes, as did I, Katie, as you know.
You did Dawson College Radio.
Yes, correct.
Right? Okay, so does that reach beyond the campus?
No.
Ours was citywide, baby.
All right.
Citywide.
You were a big deal.
I was not a big deal, but I had a heavy metal radio station that had a fair amount of listenership because, again, very limited options. And I would get CD discounts.
Oh, that's the reason you did it.
Because they knew I was the radio show host. No, it made me feel pretty cool. That was the cool notoriety.
It's pretty great. That's a pretty good fact about you.
But this isn't a podcast about radio shows.
All right, so let's talk about radio shows that we've hosted.
It's a podcast about science.
I love comedy.
We start by doing what, Vinny? What's the beginning of the show?
We do a little bon terre. Which we've done. Check.
Yes, check.
And then we exchange some science facts before we get to the good stuff, which is our guest coming up.
Yes, they bring the knowledge.
They bring the deets.
They put an end to this unrelenting goofiness.
All right. Well, we should swap science facts so we can get to our guest.
Okay, then. Who's first? Who's on first?
I can go first.
Go, Vinny.
How do you like this fact?
Whoa, that's how you should introduce your facts.
All right, so this is hot goss. A paper came out in Nature. Immediately controversial. Immediately controversial. So a study came out saying that they believe that there was a population collapse down to 1,000 precursors to humans. Like about roughly 800,000 years ago.
Yeah, I saw this.
They said that whatever precursor to human it was, it's not like Homo sapiens, and it's like
frogs.
It's a long time ago. Yeah, some human frog hybrid was walking around before they diverged into frogs and humans. Was walking around. There was 100,000 of them, and this paper says there was a 100,000 year extreme cold period that dropped the population down to just roughly 1,000 individuals.
Wow.
Just enough to stave off extinction and rebuild the population.
There is some cannibalism, let's be honest.
I mean, if you're hungry and it's cold, they're preserved, so. Yeah, so what they did was this is many unproven, they used a lot of kind of assumptions and novel ideas to
like good science.
Make these conclusions. But the idea is they looked at DNA variability and assume that the correlation between the more variability you have within a certain sequence of like genes that cover a thing that still does the same thing within populations. And they looked at 3,000 people across Africa, Europe, and Asia. And the idea is the more variability you have within these genes, the larger the population, just because, if you have fewer people, the variation gets smaller. If you have lots of people, the variation can be larger. And you can also have a clock on when some of these genes appeared in our genome. And so the clock for around 800,000 years ago, there's surprisingly little variability for something that you would assume has been around and mutating and developing and becoming variant over those 800,000 years. Surprisingly little variance, which means that in theory, there was a very small population who was passing on these genes at that time. And so the idea is they can try to correlate it to a actual number of people And so the idea is we went from 100,000 people to 1,000 people. And I use the term people loosely because I don't know that we would recognize them as Homo sapiens. They're, again, precursors to even Neanderthals. And maybe part frog, according to Katie.
Well, I'm the biologist.
So this is interesting that,
Wow.
we may have come very close to extinction at a certain point in our history.
Wow. And will again.
And we're going to try it part 2.
Who will be the top 1,000? What do you think?
Probably, what? People who have a lot of money are like banking on like having these underground bunkers. But I think it's just going to be some schmo who lives in the woods.
For sure.
Like doesn't care, just has their own source of water. And it's like had no clue that any of this happened.
Skills.
And survival skills,
I think they're going to matter.
Yeah. If you have social skills, you're like, hey, you're like a decent person and you live in the woods alone. Maybe you find, someone to hang out with, have a few babies. You live near someone else who also has this. Your kids and their kids have some babies. Maybe maybe there'll be 1,000 of us
Vinny's
kicking around.
thought about this. He has a plan.
I have a plan to make some babies.
Well, I wish we would have talked about this, Vinny, but good for you. Interesting fact.
Yeah.
Interesting that you come from the world of the living, because you usually bring us some physical science.
Yeah,
facts.
yeah.
It's
but
good.
this is hot news that just dropped, and it is extremely controversial. People are really disputing a lot of the assumptions made.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Who knows if it pans out?
Who knows? It could all be phony baloney.
That's science. All right, Katie.
Well, okay. Vinny, have you heard of Ozempic?
Ozempic. Oh, that's that drug you see commercials for.
Yeah. Do you have any idea what Ozempic was first used for?
So I know that it's being prescribed for people as a potential weight loss, anti-obesity drug.
Correct. It's not its primary.
That wasn't
use.
its right. Kind of like Viagra was not its primary
Totally.
use. It was a heart and blood pressure control.
It did not work for that.
No, but it had a wild side effect.
A far more profitable side effect.
So Ozempic, let's see. I guess if it's being used to control obesity, then it was probably for something like kidney failure or some totally random gallbladder ejection.
So it's not so far from it. It's for diabetes.
Oh, okay.
So it's like this amazing, very useful medication for diabetes. But they also noticed that it had this side effect that for people in certain parts of the world is also an issue. That is treating obesity. Mm-hmm. So it's like this. They don't want it to be called a wonder drug.
Right.
But it has fairly few side effects. And it's not, something that's like taking, speed or ephedrine or something like that.
Sure. Another common cure for obesity.
Well, some people did that to stay on, if your heart's palpitating and spending all that energy, that's one way to get rid of it. So what it seems to do, and it's not a super old medication, so we're still kind of understanding exactly what's happening, but it affects your brain more than anything else.
Really?
And you just don't obsess about food anymore.
Wow.
So a lot of people eat, emotional eating, you're just thinking of food, you're bored, right? That's what leads a lot of us to eat. And what does that make you think, people's relationship with food when they have an unhealthy relationship? What does that sound like? Another affliction common to humanity.
Like a
Obsessed
psychological?
with thinking about food, can't help eating more food.
Like a beaver who can't stop chewing down trees. That's what it makes me think of.
Humans.
Oh, humans. Okay.
Humans. What is another thing that we get sort of addiction. Other addictions.
Okay, addictive behavior.
You could argue that this is a lot of this comes from food addiction. So they've started to explore these drugs. So Ozempic is one of a couple ones. There's another one called Wegovy.
Okay.
Kind of looks like Wegroovy. Wegroovy and Ozempic. They're a type of drug called semaglutide. Semaglutide is the name of the drug.
Okay.
And it's been shown recently, hot new study.
Yes, I can't wait.
In mice and rats that it helps with alcohol addiction.
Oh wow! Those bars are filled with mice and rats. Just drinking away their problems.
I mean, if I lived like a rat, I think I'd be drinking.
Sure.
I'm going to be honest. So what they did was, sadly, research.
Right.
How are you going to figure this out?
You got to get the rats hooked on booze.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So they had to get a bunch of alcohol addicted rodents, and then they would treat them with these drugs, and they would just choose not to drink. And kind of adorable, amongst the different alcohols would also choose less the high caloric ones.
Okay.
So they would curb back their alcohol intake, but also stay away from the sugary drinks.
Right. You got the Coors Light.
they would go for the Coors Light low carb.
Yeah.
Because they're also the drug also makes them want to consume less calories.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's this whole area, and as you know, drugs for treating addiction are tricky and have not been super successful, and so they're optimistic that it may help with things like opioid addiction and alcohol addiction, which of course are
really
always
tough,
a plague. Which is interesting because it's just your brain. And like the side effects
just your brain.
No, but like attacking the brain.
What's happening here? It's just your brain. We're attacking it. Chill out.
It's interesting to pursue having a drug address your thoughts being the route to success for things like addiction. Right? You just stop obsessing about it. It makes it much easier for things like willpower to actually succeed.
For sure.
Right?
I mean, our brain is just a big chemical computer. So if you can throw chemicals in there to like hack at it, you're in the system, man. You could kind of rewrite it through chemicals.
Yeah, and it's not that there's no side effects. For some people, it doesn't work. For some people, the side effects are like IBS.
Sure.
But it's like, okay, I'll take the runs if it fixes my addiction.
Some people, it turns you into a rat.
Well, yes, but that's very rare.
Because they start off as a rat, probably.
As a Coors
drinking rat. That's the next commercial.
So interesting.
Wow.
We'll see how that works. This may become this, this wonder drug that we're all taking with our multivitamins. So
vitamin C, some cod liver oil, and some semaglutides.
But because it's so good for weight loss, there's shortages.
Oh, really? It's in high demand.
It's like exploded over the summer. All this like celebrities and rich people who are doing it as a really, instead of having your stomach
pumped,
not pumped. That's not what they do.
That's what I do.
Having that intestinal that stomach surgery,
gastric bypass.
Yes, that's what it's called. Or other more invasive drugs, right? People are doing it like chiclets over there to stay thin with zero effort.
Chiclets. The go-to gum of choice.
They're no thrills. They're pretty good.
Soap gum. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, I guess it's a hot new thing.
Yeah, everyone wants it, but it's really sad for people with diabetes.
Well, we don't care about them.
Vinny, take that back, please.
Okay.
We absolutely do care about you.
Them. I'm sorry.
For one, we are not taking Ozempic.
No.
Okay, we are eating our candy and keeping it.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone with diabetes, I hope you find some other cure that is less profitable to other people.
Treatment.
Yeah, treatment. Yeah.
All right, well, that's enough out of us. Enough non-facts out of us. It's time for us to invite our guest to join us. And I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming our guest this week, which is Lyne Baaj. Lyne Baaj is currently a master's student in neuroscience at McGill University. Her research focuses on investigating the effects of cannabis use on depression and anxiety symptoms. In her free time, Lyne loves hiking with her dog and baking. Welcome to the show, Lyne Baaj.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Hey,
thank you for being here. We're talking about the brain already.
Yeah, we're talking about the brain, hacking the brain.
So, as a neuroscientist, my good heavens, cannabis. We've had one guest talking about cannabis.
To improve athletic performance.
Yes.
And so now, it's a whole other field.
Let's start by talking about what does the cannabis do to our brains?
Oh, that's a...
easy. First, we'll start with an easy question.
It's hard to answer because we don't know as much as we would like.
Wow.
So it binds to cannabinoid receptors. So the very famous ones are CB1 and CB2. So CB stands for cannabinoid. CB1, the receptor, it's everywhere in the brain, one of the most ubiquitous receptors in the brain. So THC binds to that, and beyond that, it gets very tricky.
Sure. Yeah. And why do we have cannabis? So if we have receptors specifically for cannabinoids, it suggests to me that we evolved consuming them. Like, where are the cannabinoids in our environment? Other cannabinoids?
Well, we have endocannabinoids. So those are actually cannabinoids that circulate in our body, which also bind to cannabinoid receptors. And actually, a little fun fact, they were discovered because of cannabis research. So, yep, that's why they're named endocannabinoids.
So we make them ourselves?
Yes, we all have them. And they're very important in stress regulation and Yeah, they have different roles, but they're very big in stress regulation. So they bind to cannabinoid receptors.
What if I take a drug test at work and they're going to see I'm positive for endocannabinoids and think I'm doing drugs, right?
But you're just stressed. Or for Katie's case, her regular level of stress.
Is that going to happen, Lyne? That's why we had you here. I have a drug test tomorrow. I'm worried about my endocannabinoids.
It will happen because drug tests will measure, THC or its metabolites. But one interesting thing about drug tests and cannabis is that cannabis can stay in your body for 28 days, which
Whoa!
is very, very long. So you can still be positive for cannabis even if you haven't used it in a month.
Wow. Why does this take so long to break down?
Because it lives in the fatty tissue. Very different from other drugs. And so it takes a very long time for it to be completely out of the body. 28 days. Yeah.
Is your studying looking at like cannabis consumption in a specific way, like, or just general cannabis consumption? Is it like smoking, edibles, or other ways of ingesting it?
We do recruit participants who use cannabis in any way. We are very careful to ask them a million questions about how much they use, when they use it, how many times per day, percentage of THC, all of that. We record all of that information, and that helps us get an idea of their habits and their patterns of use. One thing that our participants do have in common is more problematic cannabis use. We call that a cannabis use disorder, which some symptoms involve a cannabis dependence. So that, for instance, tolerance, craving, things like that. And then other symptoms involve just problematic cannabis use, like using cannabis in risky situations, so things like that.
Whoa. And have you ever pulled the joke when, people come in for the cannabis study and say, I'm a cop, you're busted? Do you ever pull that joke? And how do people respond to it?
It seems unprofessional.
I haven't pulled that joke, but I have had participants be worried that we might bust them. I want to be sure that is not what I'm here to do.
Also, cannabis is legal in Canada.
I didn't say it was a good joke. Yeah, so this lab you're working in, is it focused just on cannabis, or is that a main research focus? And how has that exploded with the legality of it? Like, did it not exist before? It's just a whole lot easier.
It definitely is a lot easier. So we don't give our participants cannabis. We just recruit people who are currently using cannabis. So that big difference in how easy it is to research. Our lab is an addiction and mental health lab. Right now, we are focused on cannabis and nicotine/tobacco. My research, though, focuses on cannabis, but I have some colleagues that look at co-use, so nicotine and cannabis co-use and how that might impact the brain and everything like that.
So what kind of questions are you asking of them?
Oh, you ask everything. So I'm focused on mental health, so I look at depression and anxiety symptoms, but we also do MRIs. We also take blood withdrawals, so we look at endocannabinoid levels. Not a lot of research on that. There needs to be more, so we're making that happen. We look as well at cognition, so that includes memory, impulse control, theory of mind, things like that. And so we are looking at everything as much as we can, really. Yeah.
Now, you said theory of mind. I have no idea what that is.
What the hell is that?
What is a theory of mind?
Whoa.
All the psychology students, I'm sure will know, but that's a great question. So theory of mind is something we kind of get when we grow up. It's our ability to understand that other people think differently than we do. So for instance, let's say I hide a doll in a box and then I leave the room. And then someone else moves the doll in a different box. Let's say you're an observer. You saw that person move the doll in a different box. And then you're asked, where would I come and look for the doll? You'd say, well, in the box I left it in, even though the doll isn't here yet. And that's one way to test children for their theory of mind. So that's the way we understand that people might not have the knowledge that we do and think differently. Yeah, that's something we acquire, develop. Yeah.
And I mean, this is interesting. So what's your backstory, Lyne, with dolls that you're hiding dolls in boxes? Like, what's happening there? Some deep-seated Barbie issues?
Oh my gosh, no, that's just a classic example of all learned in Psychology 101.
You're really coming after the psychologists here.
Yeah. Classic doll in a coffin. Classic doll in a coffin. Okay, and MRIs. So what do the MRIs show you? Are you just sort of looking at this? If you use more cannabinoids, this part of your brain lights up less. That's that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so we look at so that light up is more functional. So looking at different parts of your brain when they're activated, and then we also look at structural. So that's literally the size, things like that. So we look at both, and I'm not using that data, so I'm not as knowledgeable, but there are differences. So for instance, if you quit cannabis for 28 days, we do see improvements in your brain physically, which is really cool. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
All right.
Like, what does an improvement in someone's brain look like?
Bigger brains.
No, smaller brains.
Better theory
Tighter.
of mind. You can find the doll instantly.
You know exactly where the doll is.
No matter what. 1,000 boxes, you'll know.
I know exactly where the doll is.
Well,
how about we let her answer?
One great example is, so you remember I mentioned cannabinoid receptors, CB1.
Mm-hmm.
So when you use cannabis for a really long time and very often, you actually have less of them. So that can be a problem. We call that downregulation. Just after 28 days of cannabis abstinence, so you quit cannabis for 28 days cold turkey, you actually have more cannabinoid receptors. So you go back to normal. So that's an example of an improvement, is having that level of cannabinoid receptors in the brain go back to normal after quitting cannabis.
Fascinating.
And I would imagine that has something to do with like regulation of gene expression. Your body's like, whoa, I have 10 receptors, but a crap ton of this cannabis stuff. Let's cut back the receptors. We'll stop making so many to get these levels back down. Is it something like that?
I'm not quite sure. I think the research is still young. These are things that tend to be harder to research and those questions tend to be harder to answer.
Yeah.
It sounds like Katie knows it.
No, I'm just,
just
I like to anthropomorphize my receptors.
Just publish your paper, Katie.
No, it usually ends up being something intuitive like that. I'll publish it. Nature, maybe.
Yeah.
Nature. Yeah. Now you're looking at how cannabis affects anxiety and depression symptoms. Are there particular symptoms that it's better at reducing?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question so that I can
nailed it. Got the good question.
My research. So there's a very big understanding in Canada that cannabis helps anxiety and depression. This is a very common belief. So last year in 2022, 48% of people believed that their cannabis use helped their mental health.
Wow.
8% believed that it hindered it. Now, what's interesting is that in literature, we actually find that cannabis might, and this is a big word, I hate using it, but in my cause, the actual terms that we're using is maintain, precipitate, and worsen symptoms of anxiety and depression.
Okay.
What I'm looking at is, what if you quit cannabis for 28 days? What happens to your symptoms of anxiety and depression? Do they improve? Do they stay the same? Do they worsen? That's what we're trying to understand.
That's a big question.
It's an important question. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Are there certain symptoms that seem to be more triggered or relieved by it? Or like across the board, all the top 20 symptoms of depression and anxiety can be affected?
I know with depression, well, for one, research is showing that there's more of that effect with depression than anxiety. So it seems like cannabis might worsen symptoms of depression more than anxiety. One symptom of depression that's also its own disorder as well as suicidality, which also seems to be involved in this as well. So we do see higher rates of suicidality as well. And this might be like a temporal association where you use cannabis and then you feel this way rather than the opposite.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so how are people so wrong? They're like taking it and half of people are like, this is helping me so much, man. But then the literature is saying like, no, it's making it worse. Like, how is it like maybe doing both, or we don't know what's happening there?
There's a few theories. One of my own kind of understanding is this idea of medicinal cannabis is everywhere. But I don't think we're doing a good enough job at explaining what medicinal cannabis is, what its roles are. So when people hear medicinal cannabis, they don't know what it does, and they notice that they feel a little bit better when they're high. It kind of reinforces that idea that, well, maybe cannabis helps with anxiety and depression. Another factor as well is withdrawal symptoms. A very common withdrawal symptom of cannabis addiction is anxiety and depression. If you quit something and you feel worse, you might be inclined to think, well, maybe that thing was helping me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
And so what do they mean when we say medicinal cannabis?
So cannabis has been researched in medicinal contexts for nausea, appetite in the context of cancer. It's also been very recently approved as an epilepsy treatment.
Oh, wow.
Yep, by the FDA in the United States. But in the concept with epilepsy, it's pure CBD. That's at least what I read. Yeah, it's not my field, so please don't quote me on that. But
Sure.
But I've read, yeah, so it's recently been approved for epilepsy. It has not been approved for anxiety or depression.
Wow.
And you hear about a lot of medicinal cannabis for cancer. So is that just because it's really good compared to other medications, especially good at reducing pain? Like how does it help someone with cancer, medicinal cannabis?
I know it helps with appetite and nausea. So that's one of its use.
Right.
A lot of why it's prescribed. It's also researched as an anti-inflammatory agent as well. So there's loads of research now on it as well. Not my field as much. Cannabis is such a wild field.
Yeah,
it's
sure.
a big field, yeah. And so how are you checking to see like what the effects are? Like do you put them in the MRI machine, you ask them questions? What's the methodology here?
So for my own research, I ask them questions. So we use structured interviews or self-report questionnaires to get a sense of their symptoms. So these are all validated measures, which means that they've been used loads of times. We know how they work, and we're able to quantify their symptoms. So give them a score, like you have a score of 6 on the depression scale type of thing, and then we compare those.
Is there any concern when you're having? I mean, I can't imagine the things you have to deal with when you have people self-reporting. So you're self-reporting people who are currently taking or have stopped taking a drug that was recently made not illegal, and checking to see like if it's good for them, basically. So is there concern about people being like, oh, I feel amazing when I'm on the weed lady published that weed's good for me, so mom will buy it for me? Is there any concern that people sort of falsify?
Wait, my mom is going to buy it for me?
That people sort of falsify it to make it look good? Like, or how do you deal with, issues of self-reporting?
We built a lot of trust with our participants. I actually see them twice a week for a month. There's lots of trust. Our questions are also framed, they're not specifically asking how they feel when they feel high, but rather how they feel in this moment or in the past week. And so it more centers on their mood in general rather than their mood in a certain instant. So that's how we're able to give a little bit more accurate results that aren't biased.
Report. Set collection. Discrepancy straight-lined, Moth said. Meet Moth. Moth travels everywhere and everywhen in search of, often deadly, discrepancies, and tries to make sense of the briefs she gets from collection. There were holes in the brief, I don't like that. The Moth Collection Podcast. It's science fiction with a little bit of horror. It's weird and funny and romantic, and there won't be another season. 14 episodes, and that's it, people. Available wherever you get your podcasts. Presented by Podcavern.
Yeah, and this sounds really tightly linked with like psychology. And so you're studying neuroscience. Like, sounds like a huge overlap. Like, is there like a collaboration between the fields? Do you have to become an expert in psychology yourself? Like, what's the interrelation between those disciplines?
Well, everyone actually in my lab has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. So that's my case as well. I majored in psychology and then I moved into the field of neuroscience.
Okay.
I think it overlaps in psychiatry, kind of that combination.
Right.
Yes, so our principal investigator is also based out of the Department of Psychiatry at McGill.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is it even possible to get an undergrad in neuroscience? Because that seems to be the pattern. Like people go through psychology into neuroscience in their grad school.
You can definitely. I know I went to the University of Waterloo where they didn't have that possibility, but I know, for instance, Guelph University has undergrad in neuroscience. Many universities do, and it really depends on how much research and presence they have in neuroscience. McGill is one of the best universities for neuroscience. Loads of research coming out of McGill in neuro. So I'm excited to be here.
I mean, we all love the story of Dr. Penfield.
Yeah, classic.
Classic burnt toast guy.
That Bellini building is amazing. Yeah, it's great. So we all know we're not big cannabis people. I'll full tea. I've taken CBD oil because I'm a very anxious person and I sometimes struggle with sleeping, and I've tried to take it as a sleep aid, but I feel like it does very, very little. Is there big differences between like the THC and the CBD in terms of how they affect you? Like, have you noticed a trend with the people who self-report taking lots of or really high THC end up having worse anxiety or vice versa?
They're so different that it's hypothesized that they have opposite effects on you.
Whoa.
Wow.
Yeah. So what we see with THC is that if you take it in low doses, it might make you feel a little bit better when you're high. That doesn't mean it makes you feel better on the long term. That's very important, but you might feel a little less anxious when you're high. Now, if you take THC in very large doses, you might actually feel a lot more anxious. You might psychosis and paranoia symptoms. So we call that a dose-dependent effect. Where low doses might make you feel less anxious, while high doses might make you feel worse.
Whoa.
That's like hot sauce. A little bit of hot sauce, great. Too much hot sauce, I'm in trouble.
Classic hot sauce comparison. So would medicinal cannabis then be like super high in CBD and not so much THC, or it's just really well regulated? Like how would it differ from the stuff I get from my neighborhood dealer?
Mm-hmm. Well, with CBD right now, if you go, for instance, like to buy it in the store, it's very hard to get pure CBD that doesn't have THC. Yeah. But yes, we do see a lot of that medicinal purposes. They're centered on pure CBD. THC, what I think is really important to know is that it has addictive properties. Mm-hmm. That's a message I really want to drive home. That's a huge misconception that THC isn't harmful. THC has addictive properties. CBD doesn't seem to have those.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah, it doesn't make you high. It just chills you out. So I guess it's less of a extreme feeling, perhaps, to get stuck on.
And do they both work on the cannabinoid receptors?
I don't know as much about CBD. I know it's not that I don't know. I know that the research field in itself is a little bit
still figuring it out.
They're still figuring out on the mechanisms, but THC definitely works greatly on CB1 receptors.
Mm-hmm. And so how far are you along in this research?
I've just started 1 year ago. Okay. Our lab is quite new, so we're still recruiting participants quite actively, but there's been loads. So what we use is called an abstinence paradigm. So we get people to quit cannabis for 28 days. This has been done for quite a while now. It's a very effective method to understand the benefits and the risks of quitting cannabis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how has researching this affected your feelings towards it? Like with all you've learned about cannabis, has it changed sort of your perceptions of what it can and can't do for people?
I think it has. I think going into it, I didn't realize just how harmful it can be. That's definitely not a substance I feel excited to try. I think it takes the fun out of it when you start to learn all of the risks. And so I think this has been something that I've come to find out is just, yeah.
So what are some of those? Like, so obviously being addicted to it is never a good thing, but what are some other sort of harmful effects?
It can definitely impair your memory. That's a big one that's being researched. It can impair your memory because as well, we find a lot of CB1 receptors in the parts of the brain responsible for memory. So that helps us explain why. So it can impair your memory. As I've shared, it can impair your mood. It can worsen your symptoms of anxiety. It can worsen your symptoms of depression. There's also been research now looking into its association with psychosis. So that's also a great deal of research on that field. Yeah, that field.
And does it seem like after the 28 days that it mostly goes away, or do you think, or have you seen that some of these things are sort of permanent after a certain amount of usage?
Well, with when it comes to mood, there's been loads of research now looking into that, and they've found improvements in different populations. So there's been lots of research specifically in psychiatric populations. That's people with different disorders, like for instance, schizophrenia, even depression. So they've found improvements in those fields. It hasn't been researched yet in just a healthy sample, adult sample with no psychiatric disorders other than a cannabis use disorder. So that's the gap I'm filling, but we have seen improvements. Yeah.
That's fascinating. What does like a typical day look like for you? Are you like
smoke a doob?
You're like operating an MRI machine. I picture giant levers like a bulldozer. Or you're like interviewing people in a room.
A lot of talking. Yeah. Data analysis.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't operate the MRI machine. We have MRI techs that are trained to do that, so that's really
okay.
But I get to learn from them, and I get to sit in on those sessions, and I get to see the brain live on the screen, show up on the machine. That's really cool.
Do you ever get to hop in there just for fun?
I wish I
in the brain.
Just get a picture of your brain is something pretty cool.
Frame it.
Yeah, frame it. This is my brain.
We do actually.
You could get any old brain. So go ahead.
We do that for our participants. Yeah.
That's the perk.
That's the perk. I would love that. I'm gonna start smoking marijuana so I can be part of this.
Don't do it.
I'll stop for 28 days.
Vinny, don't. You've stopped for 40 some years so far. Lyne, does there seem to be an effective mode of delivery on sort of how harmful it is or how addictive it is? Like, people who smoke cannabis tend to be way more addicted than people who eat it. Like, is it really just the amount of drug, or does mode of delivery matter? Yeah.
It definitely does. So for instance, when we look at edibles, they can be quite dangerous because it takes a little bit longer to kick in. It has to go through your digestive system first. So we actually see sometimes overdoses. Sometimes children confuse those brownies for a treat, and they end up in the ER. So that's to keep in mind with edibles. They take longer to kick in, and we see overdoses. There's also the idea that multimodal use, so that's using it in different ways, might actually be harmful, and it might be a risk for addiction and other substance use as well. So we see that association where, for instance, teens who use cannabis in different ways might be more likely to, for instance, also have an alcohol use disorder or
the old gateway drug paradigm.
Would multimodal be like they're doing it two ways at the same time? Like they're smoking while they're chewing?
At the same time?
Or just like this week, Tuesday, smoked. Wednesday, brownie. Thursday, oiled it up. Like
no, more like that. Yeah, I think it's as organized and planned, but yes.
I was going to say, like, yeah, someone smoking a pack of cigarettes with 60 nicotine patches would seem like you might have an addiction problem. Multimodal, too much.
And so, like, how did this kind of catch your eye? Like, what drew you to this field?
Yeah, Lyne, why are you researching drugs?
I actually started getting really interested in this field in high school. This is going to sound so weird, but I used to have a notebook that I would actually like learn about different drugs, and I would draw their structure, look at how they, like what receptors they bound to in the brain, what parts of the brain they activated / deactivated. And I thought that learning about this was such a wonderful way for me to learn about the brain and like what happens when you throw things at the brain and make things go wrong. And I really learned a lot about the brain by learning about how things can go wrong. And then parallel to that, I really enjoyed advocating for mental health and mental wellness. This is something I've been doing since high school. And for me, it kind of all came and intersected in this research where I get to really advocate for more informed cannabis use, harm reduction, things like that. I get to advocate for this and at the same time learn about the brain and solve problems.
Yeah.
What are some? Oh man, I wish we had this notebook handy. What is at least one example of like, oh, this was so cool when I found out how this affected the brain. Whoa, man! Is there any that you remember from your fancy notebook? Like, I had no idea ice cream did this to my brain or something.
The chemical compound of ice cream.
Ice cream's doing something. It does something to me for sure.
I think one of the most interesting ones was cocaine. Honestly, I think it was fascinating the way it works in the brain. The reason it's fascinating in not a great way is that it makes it really hard to develop treatments. It doesn't work like, so with opioids, you can use an naloxone spray and, knock the opioid out of its receptor and the person kind of revives in just moments. With cocaine, you can't do that. It's made it really hard for people to develop treatments. But now what they've been doing is injecting people with enzymes that degrade cocaine and getting it to, degrade in the body and treating cocaine overdoses that way. Wow. Fascinating field. Yeah.
So what does cocaine do to the brain?
So why is it, what's the cocaine doing?
It prevents dopamine from being the reuptake of dopamine into the presynaptic cell. So basically dopamine ends up accumulating and that causes problems. It can cause psychosis, paranoia. Wow. It has effects as well on the heart, body temperature, lungs, and people end up dying from seizures as well. People end up dying from those symptoms.
And so I guess the reason why it's hard to treat is because it's not like a new chemical. It's just preventing this chemical from going away, but we need that chemical. So how do you specifically target holding onto a chemical too long in a place, right?
Yeah, and if you knock cocaine out of its receptor and replace it with something else, it still blocks the channel. You can't go back in. It's still there. So that's why the treatments that have been ongoing now is just metabolizing it, just getting rid of it as quickly. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Wow, very cool. So what was little Lyne like? Was little Lyne always fascinated? Always had a little, I'm just picturing like you, but like with like pigtails and you're really tiny and you have your little notebook.
Yeah, drawing molecules.
Yeah. Were you always interested in science and the brain, or like how did your scientific part of your life develop?
I actually wasn't always interested in science. I was definitely very confused growing up, not really knowing what my interests were, but I was a very creative person and I love talking. I love talking. And I kind of throughout high school fell in love with mental health advocacy. I really did. I really loved doing that. I actually even started a club in grade 12, going from classroom to classroom, trying to get people to know resources, mental health resources. You're not alone. You can get help. And I also really enjoyed my science courses. I really enjoyed my neuroscience units and my bio classes. Yeah. And it really, I think, came together in grade 11 and grade 12. I went to school in Ontario, so a little different than Quebec. But in grade 11, grade 12, it came together for me where I realized I could combine these interests and do something with this, which has led me into the field I am today.
Amazing. And how do you see this evolving? Like, where can you see yourself down the road?
My dream would be to become a physician. So specifically, I'd like to work in family medicine. Get a certificate in addiction medicine, support people with addiction. That's my dream, ultimately, become a physician and to, I get to really support people. I love those human connections and using my knowledge to promote the health of people and prevent disorders. So that's really my dream, but I'd also love to teach. So ultimately, I think the best case scenario is I end up with an MD and a PhD and I get to do both. Yeah. But that's like 8-10 more years of education.
Yeah. It's not tomorrow.
A long-term plan, 10-year plan. Yeah, you've mentioned mental health advocacy quite a few times. Is there any sort of message you'd like to get out there on this platform? Something you'd like to say, or a resource you know of for kids who might be listening, or anything like that?
I would love people to know that they're not alone and that they can get help. One of the hardest things to do when we feel down, when we feel awful, is to talk about it. We can get really scared. Sometimes just reaching out to a stranger on a crisis text line is an incredible start. The more we talk about it, the easier it gets. So there's this incredible resource that I love. It's called Resources Around Me from Kids Help Phone. They have an entire database where you plug in your city, you plug in your needs, and it shows up with resources literally around you. So favorite links, I really love people to know about it.
And what do you think is like a main reason that prevents people from getting the help that they need? Just access and knowing what to do and just general inertia?
Yeah, I think definitely knowing who to turn to is a big one. Sometimes you don't have people in your life who you can trust and you don't know who, is available to help. So that's a big reason. But as well, sometimes people might feel ashamed or they might feel like they're a burden to others. And I really want to let people know that, if someone, doesn't want to help, it doesn't mean that other people won't. There's people for you out there that are here and ready to help. There are resources that are available. You really aren't alone.
What a beautiful message. Lyne, I mean, she does so much. Just discovering stuff about our brains and wanting to help people out. Need more people like her.
Yeah, brains and people.
Now, you have a dog you like to go hiking with. Let's talk about this dog. What kind of dog? We don't know much about dogs, but what type of dog?
I know what a dog looks like.
Yeah, 2 ears, a nose and a mouth. What type of dog? What's their name?
His name is Oscar. He's an Australian Shepherd.
Very cute. And where do you go hiking? You're from the general Montreal area. You have favorite places to hike?
Not in Montreal. He lives in Ontario with my parents now. I just moved out of Ontario into Quebec, but I come visit him all the time. We love to go on just hiking trails around Waterloo. That's where he lives. That's where I used to live. And yeah, there's lots of little hiking trails and conservation areas that he loves to go to. And
who likes hiking more, you or him?
Definitely him. I have that hard for me.
Just let him do it. Just hold on to the leash and let him do the hiking. He'll probably prefer it that way if he's dragging you.
That's
the thing with dogs.
That's amazing.
They like work. And you like baking. What's your favorite thing you've baked recently?
Yeah.
I make a really great cheesecake.
Oh, what cheesecake.
Yeah, it's from the Bon Appetit test kitchen, the BA test kitchen. They have a cheesecake recipe. Yeah.
What flavor? What flavor?
Yeah, what's your go-to cheesecake?
Just a simple vanilla with some red fruit coulis. So just a classic cheesecake.
Can you send some through Zoom right now?
Yeah.
Then I'll take my Ozempic to prevent me from eating the entire cake. Well, Lyne, we're out of time.
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking time away from interviewing people about their drug use.
So we could interview you.
About
your drug use.
You're busted. Surprise, you're busted.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Good luck on your 20 degrees to come.
Amazing. Wow.
That was amazing.
That was so cool. I learned so much.
That's the point of the show.
I know.
Vinny,
I love it every time.
We're not big drug people.
No,
I don't think you've taken any of this
alcohol.
business.
That's about it.
Yeah, alcohol and food. That's our
those are my drugs of choice.
I've tried the CBD oil.
Right.
I don't know that it's the right thing for me, or maybe I'm supposed to take it every day, a tiny bit.
It sounds like the dosage is important.
Yeah, I think there's nothing as powerful as my anxiety and my unwillingness to give up coffee.
Right.
I bet that is not helping me.
It's not a non-factor.
There's nothing that would keep me away
from your coffee.
But we've learned a lot today. Yeah. We've learned a lot about
cannabinoids,
the big almost extinction event of humans that happened about 900,000 years ago. You did it?
It was me.
Okay. We learned about the thing I talked about, Ozempic potentially being used for addiction.
Yeah.
And we learned about cannabinoids, thanks to Lyne.
This is a really good set of facts.
Yeah, jam-packed show. Vinny, send them out on our socials, please.
Oh, people want to go on our socials? Well, why don't you go to LRG Pod? That's at LRG Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.
And YouTube.
Oh, yeah, and YouTube. Yeah, you can check out our YouTube channel. I forgot I've been putting up videos there. We have our science facts. It's just a short little snippet rather than, you're like, this podcast is so long. Well, check out our YouTube. Check out our YouTube. Just look up Learn Real Good Podcast on YouTube, and you'll see just the science facts snippets cut out, edited hot and short and fast for your pleasure.
Yikes. Okay. And what if people want to be a guest, Vinny?
Oh, if people want to be a guest, if you or you know somebody who's a STEM student and grad, why don't you send us an email at learnrealgoodpodcast@gmail.com. learnrealgoodpodcast@gmail.com.
It's funny after you've done something so many times it becomes habit, like riding a bike. But when that happens for words, it's very weird because there's not a lot of places in life where you're repeating the same couple sentences, and you're very hyper aware of how you pronounce them each time. Well, that's it. Thank you, Vinny.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Lyne.
Thank you, Lyne.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you,
and we'll see you next time on Learn Real Good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.